Welcome back. The man authorities call the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history has died. Samuel Little confessed to killing 93 people between 1970 and 2005.
It was the kind of heat that left fingerprints. A humid, heavy wetness clung to every surface in Miami that July night, thick as syrup, dense with the scent of diesel, sweat, and cheap perfume. Bars like the Pool Palace off 17th Avenue hummed with the restless energy of a city half drunk on its own contradictions. Segregation loosening its grip but not gone, Vietnam on every television set, and crime inching higher in the background like a tide no one wanted to acknowledge. Inside the dim-lit bar, the jukebox cycled through Al Green and Aretha. Men with gold teeth and polyester shirts slouched in vinyl booths, their cigarettes smoldering in cracked glass ashtrays. Among them, Marianne was impossible to miss. She was tall, about 5'6", with smooth skin and a high laugh, wearing a fitted wig and a mini dress in cheap satin. To most men in the room, she was just another shadow in the periphery, someone to be tolerated but rarely seen. But Samuel Little noticed. He was a stranger in Miami, but not a man unfamiliar with its edges. Driving a beat-up Pontiac Le Mans with Georgia plates, he watched Marianne from a distance, the kind of lingering gaze that registered to no one else. Later, outside the bar in the buzz of sodium streetlights and cicada hum, he offered her a ride. She climbed in. They headed north, leaving behind Liberty City's sagging duplexes and boarded storefronts, past the sugarcane fields that ringed the Everglades. Marianne laughed once or twice, a sound that left the car window and vanished into the humid dark. Near a dirt drive off Highway 27, Little pulled over. The car idled, headlights tunneling into sawgrass. It happened fast, his thick hands around her throat, the way her limbs kicked, the slap of skin against vinyl. He dragged her body through the muck, 200 yards into the dark, water up to his calves, leaving her beneath the mangrove canopies where no one would find her. Back on the highway, the radio played Marvin Gaye's Inner City Blues. Little drove on, as the cicadas kept shrieking, the city pretending nothing had happened. It was the kind of heat that made the asphalt sweat. Even after midnight, the air hung heavy over Miami like a wet wool blanket, clinging to skin and softening every edge of the city's late-night neon. Out in Liberty City, where the streetlights flickered and died without complaint, the night vibrated with the low hum of insects, the hiss of tires on cracked blacktop, and the occasional distant wail of a siren bleeding into the thick air. The Pool Palace sat on a sagging corner of 17th Avenue, a low-slung bar with blue-lit windows and a broken air conditioner that nobody bothered fixing. Inside, the walls sweated too. Cigarette smoke wove itself into the peeling floral wallpaper. Cheap beer turned warm in the bottle before a man could finish it. On the jukebox, Aretha and Wilson Pickett fought for space with James Brown. The regulars, men with scarred knuckles and polyester shirts stained at the armpits, clustered in booths or along the bar, watching the door, watching one another, watching for nothing in particular. That's where she was, Marianne. 18 years old, maybe 19 if you believe the ID she carried, though no one ever did. 5'6", high-heeled to 5'8", skin the color of café con leche. Her hair was a wig, cheap but well-kept, teased and styled like the girl groups on Soul Train. A clingy lavender mini dress, the hem threatening to ride too high if she shifted wrong on the cracked vinyl stool. She knew how to work a room like this, slipping between the stares and the jeers, knowing which men to sidestep and which ones might buy her a drink without expecting more. Samuel Little watched her from a booth in the back. He was 40 then, though he looked older, his face already starting to hollow, thick fingers curling around a glass of gin he hadn't touched in half an hour. He had the look of a man who'd seen enough places to understand how cities like Miami worked after dark. Out-of-towner, they'd have said. Georgia plates on the battered gold Pontiac Le Mans parked in the lot. Thick wrists, boxer's shoulders, and eyes that stayed too long on certain people and passed right through others. It wasn't the first time he'd seen her. 3 nights earlier, she'd passed him at a bar called the Pink Orchid down in Overtown, brushing past with a laugh like the chime of glass wind bells. And then again yesterday, outside a storefront church near Brownsville. The city was shrinking around them both. Tonight, Little waited until Marianne stepped outside to smoke. He followed a minute later, letting the door creak shut behind him, the music muffled. On the sidewalk, heat shimmered off the hood of his Pontiac. Cicadas buzzed in the hedges. He asked if she needed a ride. She hesitated. There were always men offering rides, and there was never anything good on the other side of them. But sometimes a girl had to gamble.
She slid into the passenger seat. Vinyl squeaked against her thighs. "Where you headed?" "Where you going?" she shot back, smirking. They pulled away, headlights tunneling into the humid dark. Past Little Havana, where the bodegas still had lights in the window. Past the boarded-up gas stations and the sagging car lots with strings of faded plastic flags. Little drove north, a direction Marianne didn't question. The Everglades lay out that way, a wall of darkness beyond the city's last neon flickers, thick with sawgrass and water moccasins, a place where men sometimes went to dump stolen cars, or settle debts no one would claim later. She asked if he had a cigarette. He gave her one. The police would never find the body. In 1971, Miami didn't look hard for girls like Marianne. Transgender, black, working the street edges of a city already overrun with vice and poverty, and violence no one wanted to admit to. The missing persons report would go unfiled. No family name to chase. No witnesses willing to testify. No evidence but a lavender dress left to rot in the muck. Samuel Little went on. Over the next 3 decades, he moved from city to city. Los Angeles, Cleveland, New Orleans, Houston, Tulsa, Las Vegas. Always the same pattern. A bar, a parking lot, a promise of a ride. Women on the fringes. Sex workers, trans women, drug users, the poor, the black and brown women no one would miss. Little knew the rules. In America, even a murder had a pecking order. Some names made headlines, others became statistics. In 2012, 4 decades after that humid Miami night, the FBI would finally trace Samuel Little's DNA to a cluster of murders in California. And it would take 6 more years before anyone realized the scale of what he had done. When investigators confronted him with a deal, confess, and they'd move him from the harsh LA County prison to a quieter facility, Little began to talk. And talk. 93 confessions, stretching from 1970 to 2005. 50 confirmed, dozens more likely. And Marianne's name was among them. Little's details, decades on, were hazy. He couldn't remember the exact street, the exact date, but he remembered her name, the wig, the lavender dress, the sugarcane fields, and the Everglades swallowing her whole. In a prison interview room, with the same thick hands and empty smile, Samuel Little took a piece of paper and sketched her face. He remembered her better than the world ever had. Miami was a city on the edge of itself. The tourist brochures still promised sun and white sand beaches, the smell of salt in the air, and clean-cut cabana boys ferrying frozen daiquiris to pretty girls in Jackie O sunglasses. But a block back from the water, the city told a different story. The economy had begun to rot from within, a corruption that started in the bones of City Hall and spread into the neighborhoods like a quiet infection. The cocaine boom hadn't arrived yet, not in the way it would by the late 70s, but the groundwork was already being laid. Poverty ran through Liberty City like a fault line, splitting homes and families. The fallout from the civil rights movement was still raw. In the years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act, white flight had gutted entire sections of the city's tax base, leaving schools half empty, businesses boarded up, and entire stretches of Overtown and Brownsville abandoned to rising crime. For women like Marianne, black, transgender, young, there was no safety net.
Police protection was never promised, and when it came, it rarely helped. The unspoken rule was simple. Girls working the street were considered part of the city's acceptable casualties. Miami's murder rates, like those in Detroit, Cleveland, and Los Angeles, climbed steadily through the early 70s, but only certain bodies merited newspaper ink. A murdered white housewife in Coral Gables could stall the evening edition. A young black sex worker found dead in a ditch near a sugarcane field might not make the police blotter. That hierarchy wasn't accidental. Law enforcement, still overwhelmingly white, operated on an unofficial economy of victimhood. The women Samuel Little targeted lived outside its margins: transient, poor, sex workers, drug users, estranged from families or entirely without them. In cases like these, investigation budgets dried up fast. The paperwork was thin. Bodies were often classified as overdoses, suicides, accidental deaths. In Miami, as in most American cities, the number of unidentified female, John and Jane Does found each year outpaced the number of solved murders by a brutal ratio. And it wasn't just negligence, it was a calculated indifference. Detectives like Bill Berry, a homicide investigator with Metro-Dade County in the early 70s, once remarked in a local paper interview that there's a pecking order when it comes to murder. He was blunt. Runaway white girl gets a citywide canvass. A Cuban exile found shot in Little Havana gets an entire task force. A dead black prostitute, Barry admitted, would often stay dead in the files. It was into that world Samuel Little moved unseen. He'd been drifting through America's cities since the 1950s. Shoplifting charges, assault arrests, breaking and entering. A petty criminal with heavyweight boxer's fists and a strange ability to disappear. When his name did turn up in connection to a murder, it was usually years later, in a tangle of files from jurisdictions that didn't talk to each other. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, wouldn't be established until 1985, and even then it took decades before cross-country pattern analysis became common practice. In the 70s, murder was largely a local concern. One dead woman in Miami wasn't linked to another in New Orleans or San Diego or Cleveland, and Little knew it. His pattern was designed for maximum invisibility. Always a woman on the margins, always alone, always strangulation, a weaponless kill that left no bullet or blade to trace. He rarely robbed his victims, rarely sexually assaulted them in a way that left evidence. And when he was done, he moved on, leaving the body in a swamp, a ditch, a back alley. In police records from the early 1970s, more than a dozen unidentified female bodies were logged in Miami-Dade County alone. Most had no next of kin to come forward, no photographs to circulate, no missing persons reports filed. In many cases, their names died with them. Marianne was one of those. Even if someone had noticed her gone, the odds of finding her were slim. The Everglades, just 20 miles outside the city, was a living graveyard. It devoured things, bodies, cars, weapons. What the gators didn't take, the water did. More than once, Metro homicide officers would dredge a canal or pull a half-submerged car from the sawgrass and find a skeletonized corpse in the trunk, months or years old, no one left to name them. In 1971, nobody came looking for Marianne, and Samuel Little kept moving. By the end of that decade, he'd killed in at least 10 states, from Arizona to Ohio, from California to Mississippi. He crossed paths with law enforcement dozens of times. Petty theft, assault, solicitation. But no one connected the dots. To the system, he was a drifter. A nobody preying on nobodies. It would take half a century, the rise of DNA forensics, and a relentless Texas Ranger named James Holland to finally unravel the size of what Samuel Little had done. But in 1971, on a humid Miami night, with the sugarcane standing tall and the city turning its back, none of that had happened yet. There was only Marianne, a lavender dress, a stretch of highway, and a man with a face no one remembered until it was too late. Wise County Jail, Texas, May 2018. The room smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was small, windowless, a dull rectangle of beige-painted cinder block meant for interviews that could last hours. An old analog wall clock ticked softly in the background. The institutional hum of fluorescent lights overhead cast a flat, grayish pallor over everything. At one end of the table sat James Holland, a Texas Ranger with salt and pepper hair and a calm, worn face. Across from him slumped Samuel Little, 78 years old, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him, the weight of decades hanging off his hunched shoulders. Holland had been chasing killers for most of his adult life. He was good at it, a slow-talking, sharp-minded investigator with the rare ability to make murderers talk. But this was different. No one had expected Little to start confessing, not like this. Not with names, faces, cars, cities. Not with the kind of recall most detectives couldn't pry from a man half his age. Yet here they were. A stack of printer paper sat between them, along with a pack of colored pencils Holland had bought from a nearby Walmart. It wasn't the kind of thing homicide investigators usually brought into an interview room, but with Samuel Little, it worked. "You good to keep going?" Holland asked softly. Little gave a toothless grin, his thick fingers drumming lightly against the tabletop. "Yeah, man. I'm all right. Got another one in mind." He reached for the pencils, yellow, brown, blue, and black, and selected one with surprising delicacy. His hands, though aged and thick-knuckled, moved with a practiced steadiness. He began to sketch. Holland watched in silence. The image took shape slowly. The curve of a jawline, a sweep of long hair, full lips slightly parted. Little's pencil shaded in the eyes last. Always the eyes. That was how he remembered them, he said. The way they looked at him, in the last seconds before their faces went slack. "This one," Little murmured. She called herself Mary Ann. He didn't pause to explain. Holland let the silence fill the room, let the story come out in pieces. It had been decades, but Little carried those faces in his head like old photographs no one else could see. "Miami," Little went on, lips pursed as he shaded a lock of hair. "This was 71, or maybe 72. Pool Palace Bar, Overtown. She was tall, pretty, fine little thing." He stopped drawing and stared at the paper. Name was Mary Ann, or Marianne, something like that. She wasn't like the others, you know. She had this way about her, walked like she owned the place. The sketch was simple, almost crude by an artist's standard, but the details were there. The high cheekbones, the soft jaw, the almond-shaped eyes. Little tapped the paper with a forefinger. "I left her out past Highway 27, sugarcane fields. No one was going to find her there." Holland jotted notes in the margin of his legal pad. He'd learned early not to press for dates or exact addresses. Little's memory, while sharp in some areas, slipped on specifics. He'd often misremember years, sometimes decades off. But faces he never forgot. The confessions had begun months earlier, almost by accident. Little was already serving a life sentence in California for 3 murders when Holland came calling. The ranger had heard whispers through law enforcement networks about a serial predator whose true body count might stretch into the dozens, maybe more. Holland was patient. He made the long trip out, sat down in the prison's visiting room, and started talking. He didn't mention murder at first. They spoke about boxing, about old cars, about the cities they both knew. Little liked that. No other cop had ever bothered with small talk. Slowly, over hours, over days, Little began to open up. By the time he was transferred to Texas for questioning, he was ready to unburden himself. Not out of guilt, Little never spoke of remorse. He told his stories the way some old men reminisce about lost loves or their favorite cars. These women were his memories, and so Holland brought paper and pencils. It worked better than photographs. Little couldn't always recall their names, but he could recall their faces. He could remember what they wore, how their hair looked, what car he was driving, what the air smelled like. It was unprecedented. By mid-2018, Little had confessed to nearly 90 murders across more than a dozen states. Law enforcement agencies scrambled to corroborate his stories. VICAP analysts matched his descriptions against decades-old cold cases, Jane Does, and missing persons reports. The details he provided, cars, locations, victim appearance, were disturbingly accurate. He'd recall a motel room's color scheme from 1983, a woman's green dress from a roadside bar in 1977, and always, the way their faces looked in the last seconds. In the Wise County room, Little finished Marianne's portrait, holding it up to the light. She was a sweet one. Didn't deserve it, he said, his voice nearly tender. But none of them did, I guess. Holland didn't reply. He never corrected Little when he spoke like that. He'd learned the confessions flowed better without moral judgment. "Did you dump her in water?" Holland asked. Little nodded. "Yeah, Everglades. Took her way back, far as the road would go. She was light, carried easy." For every confession like this, Holland knew there was a family somewhere that had spent decades wondering what happened to their sister, mother, daughter. In Marianne's case, there might not have been anyone left to care. The sketch went into the growing stack. Dozens of faces, all women, most black, many transient, some identified, most not. Holland reached for another sheet of paper. "You ready for the next one?" Little grinned again, a strange flash of boyish pleasure on an old man's face. "Yeah, man," he said. "I got lots more." The heat clung to the streets like wet wool, heavy and close even as night fell over Overtown. Neon signs buzzed to life along Northwest 2nd Avenue, advertising cold beer, cheap rooms, and the kinds of promises that vanished with the daylight. Music drifted from open doorways, Wilson Pickett, James Brown, Aretha on jukeboxes, as the neighborhood's bars filled up with the usual mix of laborers, hustlers, drifters, and the girls who knew how to navigate them all. Marianne checked her reflection in the rearview mirror of a parked Chevy Impala, running a lacquered nail down the side of her wig to smooth a stray strand. The hair was good tonight, long, dark, with a glossy sheen that caught the lamplight. She liked the way it made her jawline softer, her eyes bigger. Enough at least for the kind of attention that paid for rent. 18, just barely. Though in places like this, time passed differently. She was Marianne now, not the name written on the tattered birth certificate tucked inside a shoebox back at the boarding house. Marianne belonged to the night. She worked the pool palace sometimes, a low-slung cinder-block dive on Northwest 17th, but tonight she was headed down to the Cat's Meow, where the drinks were weak but the money better, if you knew how to tease it loose from lonely men. The streets were busy in the way of summer nights, thick with sweat and sound. The air smelled of frying grease and diesel. A Cadillac DeVille with Georgia plates idled at the curb, its driver watching her and another girl, Angela, a pale-skinned queen with a wide smile and a sharp tongue. Marianne grinned, brushing past her. "Get your ass out of here, Angie," she teased. "That one's mine." Angela laughed. "He ain't got no money, baby. I already scoped him." Marianne waved her off and slipped inside the club. The Cat's Meow was a narrow, dim-lit room that smelled of old liquor and fresh perfume. A jukebox near the door played Mr. Big Stuff, the floor sticky underfoot. Behind the bar, Miss Loretta poured gin into glasses without measuring. A few older men hunched over beers, pretending not to watch the girls drifting between tables. Marianne moved to the jukebox, slipped in a quarter. The four tops. "Ain't no woman like the one I've got." She swayed in time, feeling the beat soak into her bones, letting the eyes follow her across the room. She didn't fool herself. She knew what she was in this town. Half the city wouldn't even let her walk through the front door come daylight. Cops didn't care if you went missing. Family, if they hadn't already turned their backs, lived too far north to find you. But here, in this room, under this cheap blue light, she could be anyone. A man at the bar caught her eye. Tall, broad, heavy hands wrapped around a glass of something brown. He had that look, the kind that didn't ask questions, just wanted company for an hour or two. She thought about it. Marianne was particular, as much as a girl could afford to be in 1971 Miami. Some men were trouble, some were mean, most were just drunk and lonely. This one looked like both. She started toward him, the hem of her dress swishing against her thighs. That's when Angela grabbed her arm. "Don't mess with him, girl," she hissed. "He's off. Something wrong in his face." Marianne smirked. Ain't nothing wrong with a little green in his pocket. But Angela didn't let go. "Serious, baby. He been watching you all night." That gave her a half-second of pause. She glanced back. The man, older, with a wide nose and drooping eyelids, didn't flinch when their eyes met. Didn't even blink. A kind of emptiness behind the stare. Still, rent was due. Shaving cream was low. She needed to get right for the weekend. "Relax," Marianne murmured. "I'll be fine." Angela sighed, shaking her head. "Be careful, baby. Some folks ain't worth the dollar." But Marianne was already moving, a smile softening her features as she approached. "Evenin', sugar," she said, slipping onto the bar stool beside him. "Buy a lady a drink?" His mouth twitched, almost a grin. "Name's Sam," he rumbled. She'd spend the next 15 minutes laughing at jokes that weren't funny, sipping from a watery gin and tonic, leaning close enough to smell the sweat in his collar. He asked no questions. She offered no real answers. Outside, the night pressed closer. Streetlights flickered. The last bus of the evening hissed to a stop on Northwest 17th, its few passengers too tired to notice much. And when Sam said he had a car around the corner, a ride if she needed one, Marianne hesitated only a moment. "I could use a lift," she said. She caught Angela's look as she left, a flicker of something like fear beneath the lash-thick eyes. The car was a gold Pontiac Le Mans, big and gleaming under the street lamp. Marianne slid into the passenger seat, crossing her legs. The leather stuck to the back of her thighs. "Where to?" Sam asked. She told him about her place, halfway between Brownsville and Liberty City. But the car didn't turn that way. It headed north, past darkened storefronts, the air thick with the scent of rain and cut grass. Past the edge of the city where sugarcane fields stretched like endless black walls on either side of the road. Marianne felt a ripple then, a small, cold thing in her gut. Maybe Angela had been right. She turned to say something, but his hand was already on her throat.